Hi everyone, and welcome to taking a closer look at Chapter 4, where we talk about studying behavior. So in the last chapter, we talked about developing your research question and coming up with a hypothesis. Some of the really important parts of a research study, of course, are also identifying the variables that you want to study. So let's talk a little bit more about the differences between variables. So a variable can really be any event, situation, or behavior, or an individual characteristic. Of course, you want to pick something that varies among your population of interest. So you can actually put people into different categories or measure differences in their behavior. So typically what we say is that a variable must have at least two levels at minimum. And we also say that variables can fall into two different categories. They can either be quantitative in nature, so that means that we can measure them. Typically, that means that they're either falling into the interval or ratio data category. Some examples would be measuring a reaction time. How long did it take you to run a marathon, right? Measuring the time. Or how long did it take you to respond to a stimulus on a computer screen? That would be a reaction time. It could also be something as simple as, recording somebody's age or weight or height. And then on the other hand, we can also choose a independent variable that would be a non-quantitative variable. Non-quantitative variables are also sometimes referred to as qualitative variables. That basically just means that you're putting things into a category based on their group membership. And that, of course, usually refers to nominal data. So that would be, hair color, gender, political affiliation, those types of variables. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about independent versus dependent variables. So your independent variable, of course, is your cause variable, right? It's causing a behavior, hopefully, in the dependent variable, a change in the dependent variable. So the independent variable is the one typically that's manipulated, but as you will see, it could also be something that's just observed. So you're not actually changing it, you're just observing it. As a general rule of thumb, right, it needs to have at least two levels. An example of a person variable would be male versus female. An independent variable that you're manipulating, an example would be, a drug versus a placebo group. So you're randomly assigned to one or the other. Or if you're interested in what teaching styles work best for students and create the best learning outcomes, you could have two conditions where you use teaching strategy 1, where you're only lecturing, and teaching strategy 2, where you're actually lecturing and asking students to engage in discussion on the topic. So you could compare those two different teaching styles. That's something that you're manipulating. People are randomly assigned to one or the other group. So you are manipulating here the teaching style, and then you're observing what happens as a result. And then to observe the outcome, right, we have to look at our dependent variable, which is also sometimes referred to as our effect variable. So for the dependent variable, we're measuring an outcome or a behavior that's assumed to be caused by the manipulation of the independent variable. So the dependent variable, of course, is also the outcome or target variable that's being measured. It could be anything ranging from a percentage or a reaction time, even a yes/no response, although that would limit to some degree how much analysis you could do. But a dependent variable should be something that is kind of the outcome of your manipulation. So you have to think about what that would be and how you could measure that. So it could be, for the example of the teaching style that you're using, right? You could then give students a quiz, or you could, give a quiz and see how many of 10 questions they get correct, or you could ask them to recall as much as they can about the lecture and see if there's more detailed recall based on one teaching strategy versus the other one. Or, the example of the drug study, you would see if either the placebo or the actual experimental drug lead to a reduction in symptoms of an illness, for instance. So let's kind of test our knowledge on identifying independent variables and dependent variables. So our first scenario here is a comprehension test was given to students after they had studied the textbook material either in silence or with the television turned on. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about what the IV would be and what the DV would be. Okay, so you probably guessed it. The independent variable here would be the environment in which studying occurred, and the dependent variable would be the score on a comprehension test based on what you studied. Let's do another example. So some elementary teachers were told that a child's parents were college graduates, and other teachers were told that the child's parents had not finished high school. They then rated the child's academic potential. So think about what the IV and the DV would be for this example. Okay, so the independent variable here is the child's parents' educational level as it was described in the scenario that they showed participants. And then the dependent variable would be the rating of the child's academic potential after reading the scenario. So these are all great examples of identifying independent and dependent variables. You are probably already familiar with these concepts, so that's pretty straightforward. But there are practice examples available on Blackboard if you would like to practice some more.